Hey everyone! Today we're going to do something pretty important. We're going to pull back the curtain on music history and talk about two incredible composers who were for way too long stuck in the shadows of the famous men in their lives. So let's do a quick thought experiment. When you think of the great romantic composers, who pops into your head? Beethoven, Schumann, Chopin, Mendelssohn, right? It's a list of absolute legends. But what if I told you two of the most brilliant musical minds of that entire era are usually missing from that list just because they were women? Well, we're going to change that. Let's talk about Clara Schumann and Fanny Mendelssohn. And right there, that gets to the absolute heart of the problem. For more than a century, Clara Schumann was framed as Robert Schumann's wife. Fanny Mendelssohn was Felix Mendelssohn's sister. You see, their own identities, their own towering genius, were basically reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. But they were so much more than that.
To really understand their stories, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, back to a time of just incredible promise that ran headfirst into a wall of deeply ingrained prohibition.
What's just astonishing is that their foundations were identical to the famous men they knew. I mean, both Clara and Fanny got the absolute best musical education you could get. Clara was a touring superstar, a child prodigy by the time she was 9. And Fanny, her own brother Felix, the Felix Mendelssohn, admitted that she was the better pianist. We're not talking about talented hobbyists here. These two were titans, absolute prodigies. And then came the wall. This quote from Fanny's own father, wow, it's just devastating. He straight up tells her that her incredible talent can only ever be an ornament, something to make her a more desirable wife. For her brother, music was a career. For her, it was just a hobby. And this wasn't a suggestion, it was a command that completely defined the course of her life. So what did that command actually look like in real life? Well, Fanny was shut out of a public career. She poured all of that genius into private Sunday concerts at her home. And when it came to publishing her music, she was forbidden from using her own name. In fact, a few of her songs were published under her brother's name. It actually led to this incredibly awkward moment where Queen Victoria herself praised Felix for one of his beautiful songs, and he had to confess, actually, my sister wrote that one. Now, Clara's story, it took a very different path. At least on the surface. Her father pushed her relentlessly onto the public stage. She became one of the most famous concert pianists in all of Europe, a genuine superstar with a career that lasted 6 decades. She was the breadwinner, supporting her husband Robert and their 8 kids with her performances. But, and this is the heartbreaking twist, even with all of that fame and success, the societal pressure was just crushing. She wrote in her diary, "A woman must not desire to compose." That just reveals the tragedy of her inner world. On the outside, she was a powerhouse performer, but on the inside, she had internalized all the prejudice of her time, leading to this crippling self-doubt about her own creative genius. You can just imagine the constant push and pull she must have felt. She was caught in this web of contradictions. Her father trained her to be a world-class virtuoso, but he controlled her so tightly that he sometimes wrote in her diary for her. Her husband, Robert, relied on her musical opinion. He collaborated with her, but then he also wrote that her main occupation is as a mother. The men in her life were, at the same time, her biggest champions and her biggest obstacles. And yet, and this is the part of the story that just gives you chills, despite all of these barriers, the external ones and the internal ones, they absolutely refused to be silenced. They took all that conflict and they channeled it into creating magnificent music. And here is the proof. Just look at this. Between 1846 and 1847, both Clara and Fanny composed piano trios that are now considered absolute masterpieces. For two women working against those kinds of odds to independently create works of this caliber in the same genre at basically the same time, it's breathtaking. These aren't just good for a woman. They are landmarks of romantic music, period. But the story gets even crazier. It's one thing for your work to be suppressed, right? But it's a whole other thing for it to be lost completely, or even worse, credited to someone else. And that brings us to the wild mystery of the Easter Sonata. Okay, just follow this timeline. It tells such a powerful story. In 1828, Fanny writes this grand, ambitious sonata. For almost 150 years, it basically vanishes. When it's finally recorded in 1972, who gets the credit? Her brother, Felix. It wasn't until 2010 that a musicologist finally tracked down the original manuscript and proved, through her handwriting, that Fanny was the real author. And it took until 2017, almost 190 years after she wrote it, for the piece to be played in public under its rightful composer's name. This discovery was a huge deal. It wasn't just about correcting a historical typo. No way. It forced a complete reevaluation of Fanny's talent. This wasn't just another nice little song. It was a big, complex, structurally ambitious work, the kind scholars had always just assumed only a man like Felix could have written. It was definitive proof of her genius and a pretty stark reminder of how easily women's histories can be just erased. So, how do we correct these historical injustices? That brings us to right now, to the ongoing work of reclaiming their legacies and giving them their due. Clara's impact went so far beyond her own compositions. After Robert died, she basically dedicated her life to making sure his music would live on forever. But in doing that, she literally changed the game. She helped invent the modern piano recital as we know it. The idea of performing a whole concert from memory, programming serious masterpieces by Bach and Beethoven, that was Clara. She wasn't just a performer in the story, she was one of its most important authors. And the great news is, this effort to restore both women to their rightful place in history is happening right now. Musicians are finally recording their complete works. Orchestras are programming their music right next to Beethoven and Brahms where it belongs. And scholars are still digging, still finding more music, and inspiring all of us to ask, who else have we missed? And that's really the question I want to leave you with. The stories of Clara Schumann and Fanny Mendelssohn aren't just about music. They're about what happens when incredible talent is denied opportunity. They force us to wonder how much brilliance has been lost to prejudice, and how many other masterpieces are still out there, just waiting in the shadows to be rediscovered.